The installation had no name. It existed on no map that any government maintained, in no database that any intelligence agency had successfully indexed. It sat in the Canadian Arctic at a depth of 40 meters below the permafrost surface, carved out of the frozen earth over 3 years by David Hiles working alone and in increments, accessible through a geothermal drilling shaft that looked, from the surface, like one of 600 abandoned industrial sites scattered across this particular stretch of nothing. The air inside was cold in the specific way of places that had never been warm, not the cold of a room that had lost its heat, but the cold of a space that had never considered heat as a relevant variable. The equipment hummed. The walls were raw, insulated composite, gray-white, functional without any concession to human comfort. The ceiling was low enough that a tall person would have needed to be aware of it. Mark floated 3 feet off the floor, not dramatically, not with any awareness of how it looked. He had been on his feet for 19 hours before arriving here, and his body had made the small, unconscious decision that floating required less energy than standing. His arms were crossed, his eyes were on the wall. The wall was a projection. It covered the entire curved surface of the installation's main chamber, 40 feet of holographic climate modeling, rendered in the specific blue-gray palette of scientific data that had been stripped of everything except accuracy. No color-coded drama, no graphic design choices intended to make the information more digestible, just numbers and curves, and the shapes that numbers and curves made when you plotted them honestly across time. David Hiles stood beside the projection. He was thin in the way of people who did not experience hunger as a social event. He was pale from months underground. He had the eyes of someone who had been looking at the same data for so long that he had stopped seeing it as data and started seeing it as landscape, as terrain he moved through rather than information he processed. He did not gesture when he spoke. His hands stayed at his sides. He looked at the projection while he talked, not at Mark. "Scenario A," he said. His voice was flat, not cold, flat, the flatness of a man who had processed his horror so many times that it no longer changed the register of his speech. Current trajectory. No significant intervention. The agricultural yield curves invert within 90 years, not at the margins, at the center. The staple crop failure window opens between 2080 and 2110 and does not close. Ocean acidification passes the reef death threshold inside 50 years. The water war flashpoints, here, here, and here. He moved his hand across 3 areas of the projection without touching it, begin producing organized military conflict within 70 years. The conflict is self-amplifying because each resource contraction increases the incentive for the next conflict. He paused. Not for effect. He was reading from the model. Human extinction probability within 1 millennium, 34%. Not from a villain. Not from an asteroid. From math. From the compounding interest of 8 billion people who cannot stop. Mark said nothing. Scenario B, Hiles said. Conventional reform. Every climate accord ever proposed, modeled as if it were implemented correctly, which it never has been, but modeled as if. Green transition, population management through education and access, international cooperation frameworks at the level required. I have run this model 417 times using different political assumption sets. The consistent result? The reforms degrade. They degrade because human political systems operate on 4-year electoral cycles and geological timescales do not. Every accord loses enforcement integrity within 30 years. Every transition slows when the economic pain becomes politically non-viable. Scenario B delays the crisis. He paused. It does not prevent it. It simply ensures that the people who inherit the crisis have less time and fewer resources to address it. The hum of the equipment was the only other sound in the room. Scenario C. He moved to a different section of the projection. The curves here were different, sharper in the short term, shallower over the centuries. A managed catastrophe. The controlled release of specific stored ocean water, achieved through the detonation of ice structures I have been preparing for 14 months at depth in the Arctic and Antarctic. The surge pattern is modeled here. He indicated a set of curves that showed flooding distribution across a 72-hour window. The targeting is elevation-specific. Below 4 meters above current sea level, the flooding advances at a rate slow enough that organized emergency response can operate. I have modeled the emergency response systems of every affected region. The response will save between 60 and 70% of the affected population. Mark's jaw was tight. He kept looking at the projection. Projected casualties, 31 to 47 million. The range accounts for emergency response variance. Hiles moved to the counter-projection, a second set of curves running out 300 years. Projected lives preserved over 3 centuries, accounting for the population stabilization, the mandatory rebuilding programs I have drafted, and the enforcement mechanisms that will be required to maintain compliance. 4.2 billion. The room hummed. The math is not complicated, Hiles said. 40 million now, 4 billion later. Any civilization that would choose the 4 billion over the 40 million is a civilization that deserves to survive. We are giving humanity the chance to be that civilization. Mark uncrossed his arms. He looked at the projection for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the far end of the installation, not away from the conversation, just giving himself the length of the room, and stood with his back to the projection. There has to be another way, he said. Name it. Hiles said it without impatience, with modeling. I'll run the numbers with you. Mark turned back. We'd be deciding for 8 billion people. 8 billion people are currently deciding for 40 billion future people. They're deciding to kill them. They simply haven't acknowledged the vote. Mark was quiet. He had been quiet for most of the last 3 hours. He had come here intending to stop this, intending to find Hiles and shut down whatever was being prepared and turn him over to Cecil and return to the cycle. He had come here with that intention intact. He was not sure, standing in this room, where it had gone. Eve Wood, he started. Something almost gentle entered Hiles's voice. It was the only time during the presentation that his register changed. I know, he said. You'll have to decide whether that matters more than 4 billion people who haven't been born yet. Mark looked at the counter-projection, the curves running out 300 years, the shape of a species surviving, not triumphantly, not easily, but surviving. The projection did not moralize. It simply showed what the numbers produced. What about the people who die? He said. They're real. Yes. Hiles said it without flinching. I know their names. Some of them. I've run flood modeling overlays on census data for every affected zone. I know what professions concentrate in those elevation bands. I know which cities will go quiet. They are real people with real lives, and real people who love them. He paused. They will also be dead regardless of what we do. The timing is the only variable. In scenario A, they die in 90 years from crop failure, or in 70 from resource conflict, or in 50 from the cascading failures that follow the first irreversible tipping point. In scenario C, they die now, because of a decision we made. He looked at Mark. I have not found a way to make that clean. I have only found that it resolves. Mark stood in the cold of the installation and looked at the projection and said nothing for a long time. He thought about the cycle of it, the fighting and the resetting and the fighting again, villain after villain replaced by the next one, the world never actually getting safer, just getting through to the next crisis. He thought about the original Guardians. He thought about Eve, the first time she'd been badly hurt, her power refusing to leave her own body alone even while she slept, the specific exhaustion of someone whose gift did not turn off. He thought about Cecil's files, the things Cecil did in the name of protecting Earth, the people Cecil had ended, the programs Cecil had run. And how the math Cecil used was the same math David Hiles was using now, just smaller, just contained enough to be acceptable. He thought about 4 billion people who hadn't been born yet. He looked at the curves. He found the flaw he had been looking for. He did not find it. "Do it," he said. 2 words. Flat, not a surrender, and not a declaration. A decision. Made by a man who had run out of counter-arguments and was honest enough to stop pretending he had one. Hiles did not celebrate. He walked to the control terminal at the far end of the installation and sat down and began. The terminal screens populated with activation sequences, remote triggers, coordinates, the detonation protocols for structures Hiles had been building into the deep ice for over a year. Hiles worked through them with the same flat efficiency he brought to everything. Mark floated in place. He looked at the projection still running on the curved wall, the 3 scenarios, the curves, the numbers. He thought about Eve. The thought arrived and he registered it, and then he set it to one side, carefully, the way you set something fragile on a shelf where it would not be disturbed. The timer appeared on the terminal screen. Hiles had set it for 6 hours, long enough for them to clear the installation and reposition. Below them, through 40 meters of frozen earth, through the permafrost and the bedrock and the cold dark of the deep ocean floor, the charges waited. Mark looked at the timer. A sound came through the walls, not loud, not dramatic. A very low vibration, more felt than heard, as though the earth itself had registered a change in intention. It was probably the equipment. It was probably nothing. It did not stop. The broadcast went out at 0600 Greenwich Mean Time on a Thursday. It did not go out from a single location. Dinosaurus had spent 2 years building infiltration architecture into global communication infrastructure, not through any single intrusion, but through the patient accumulation of administrative access points at thousands of transmission nodes across 6 continents, cable relays, satellite uplinks, internet backbone routing stations, broadcast tower networks. Each access point had been obtained through legitimate seaming channels, contractor credentials, software update packages, maintenance access windows that closed before anyone reviewed the logs. When the broadcast activated, it activated everywhere simultaneously. Blocking it would have required shutting down the global communications infrastructure entirely, which no government was willing to do, and which would not have helped anyway because the signal was already inside the distribution layer before any blocking protocol could engage. The broadcast was not coming from outside the system. It was the system, for 73 minutes, speaking with a different voice. What the world saw, a man at a desk. Not a throne, not a command center with banks of screens behind him. A desk, plain, wood-surfaced, with a single monitor angled away from the camera and a glass of water that David Hiles did not drink from during the broadcast. Behind him, a window. Through the window, sky. The sky was overcast. It looked like a Wednesday morning in an office that had not been designed to impress anyone. David Hiles looked like what he was, a thin, pale man who had spent most of the last decade working underground and thinking about things that other people found too uncomfortable to think about for long. He looked directly at the camera with the particular steadiness of someone who had nothing left to perform. Mark stood behind him, and to the left. Not posed, not costumed for the moment. He was wearing the black and white suit he had switched to 6 weeks earlier. No logo, no color. The design of something that had stopped thinking about what it communicated and started thinking about what it did. He stood with his hands at his sides, not looking at the camera but at the room, the exits, the angles, the specific professional awareness of someone whose job was to ensure that David Hiles finished what he was saying. He looked like a bodyguard. That was the image that would run in every news cycle for the next decade. Hiles began, without preamble. 39,412,000 people died in the past 72 hours. He said it the way a doctor said a diagnosis, not callously, but without the softening that would have made the number easier to receive. He let it sit in the air of every living room and emergency shelter and military operations center on the planet for 3 full seconds before he continued. I know that number. I have been tracking it since the flooding began. I have the census overlay models. I know the elevation distributions. I know the emergency response capacity of every affected region, and I have been comparing projected casualty figures to actual reports as the data arrives. He paused. Every individual in that count was a person with a name and a life, and people who loved them. I am not asking you not to grieve. Grief is the correct response. I am asking you, when the grief is survivable, to understand what their deaths have prevented. He presented the data. He had prepared a simplified version of his climate modeling, the same projections he showed Mark in the installation, rendered into language accessible to a general audience without losing the integrity of the numbers. He spoke for 18 minutes about what the planet's trajectory had been. He named the tipping points. He named the timelines. He cited the sources, publicly available scientific literature, none of it his own, all of it verifiable by anyone with an internet connection and an afternoon. He was not asking for belief. He was providing coordinates. Then, he presented the planetary accord. He read each provision in order, without emphasis, without political framing. The mandatory cessation of fossil fuel energy production, the land rewilding schedule, the consumption caps and the calculation methodology behind them, the transition to modular food production systems, the Planetary Council structure and its appointment process. Existing national governments may continue to administer local affairs, he said. Courts, municipal services, cultural institutions, local economic activity. These remain under existing governance. The Accord's authority is specific. Any decision affecting global environmental metrics falls under Planetary Council review. The Council's determinations are final. He set down the paper he had been reading from. He looked at the camera. We are not asking for your approval. This is not a negotiation. The planet has been in a negotiation for 60 years, and the negotiation has produced the conditions that required the last 72 hours. We are telling you what the planet requires. We are also telling you that we are capable of enforcing it, and that we will. He was quiet for a moment. What you do with your remaining freedom within these structures is your choice. There is considerable freedom remaining. We are asking for compliance with a specific, bounded set of requirements. Everything else is yours. He looked at Mark. Mark stepped forward. He looked at the camera the way he looked at anything that required his attention, directly, without performance. He said, "Do not make me come back." 6 words, flat, no menace in the tone because menace would have implied that the statement required persuasion. He was not persuading anyone. He was providing information about the future, the same way a weather report provided information about tomorrow. He stepped back. Hiles reached forward and closed the broadcast. In Geneva, the UN Security Council had been in emergency session for 41 hours. When the broadcast ended, the chamber was quiet for a moment that the Secretary General later described, in her private journal, as the most frightening silence she had ever inhabited. Then 6 people tried to speak simultaneously, and the session devolved into the organized chaos of institutions attempting to process something their architecture had not been designed for. 3 members walked out when their advisors confirmed, through back channels, that any military resolution passed by the Council would constitute, under the Accord's classification system, a planetary threat activity triggering direct Invincible response. They did not walk out in protest. They walked out because there was no decision available to them that the room could make, and staying would have required pretending otherwise. By afternoon, 7 smaller nations had issued formal statements of compliance. not endorsement, compliance. The language was careful and cold, and had been drafted, in most cases, by lawyers who understood the distinction. The United States, China, Russia, and a coalition of 14 others convened classified military planning sessions within hours of the broadcast's conclusion. The sessions produced extensive documentation of options and a consistent conclusion that Cecil Stedman received from his intelligence contacts in 5 different capitals before midnight. None of the available military options produced an acceptable probability of success against a Viltrumite tier threat operating with full awareness of their capabilities and without the logistical constraints of a conventional military. The sessions were not terminated. They were reclassified as contingency planning for scenarios that might emerge in the future. Global markets collapsed at open. The initial shock was comprehensive. Every major index fell to levels that the automated trading halts were not designed to handle, because the automated trading halts had been designed to handle market events, not the restructuring of the global economic premise. Dinosaurus had modeled this. His projections showed stabilization within 18 months as the new consumption framework imposed its own economic logic. He considered it acceptable. The economic system being replaced had been generating the conditions for its own collapse regardless. Religious leaders released statements within hours. Most condemned. Several environmental theologians, fringe denominations that had been preaching planetary stewardship as a moral imperative for decades, released statements that were not condemnations. A prominent bishop in São Paulo said, in a press conference, that his archdiocese immediately distanced itself from, that he had read the climate data 3 years ago and wept, and that he had no theological framework for what had happened, but that he also had no theological framework for the alternative. He was removed from his position the following week. His statement was viewed 40 million times before his archdiocese could complete the removal process. Eve had been in the water for 6 hours when the broadcast played. Not in the water, above it, working at the edge of a submerged coastal district in what had been a mid-sized city on the Gulf Coast of the United States. She had been here since the flooding began. She had not stopped. She was pulling survivors from structures that were still accessible, restructuring debris into elevated platforms that would hold weight, creating water purification membranes from raw atmospheric matter at the edge of the flood boundary. She was not thinking about the math. She was thinking about the woman in front of her, who was 63 years old and had a broken wrist and had been on the roof of her house for 31 hours, with a dog and a photograph album, and who needed to get to dry ground. She got her there. She was building a shelter wall, restructuring flood debris into load-bearing composite, when someone in the growing settlement behind her turned up a battered emergency radio loud enough to reach the work site. She heard Hyles's voice. She kept working. She had been waiting for this broadcast since the flooding began. She had known it was coming. She had known since the flooding started with the specific mathematical precision that Dinosaurus's operations always carried, that there was an explanation attached to it somewhere, and that the explanation would be coherent, and that she would not be able to find the flaw in it, and that she would not agree with it. She stopped working when she heard Mark's voice. 6 words. She stood with her hands against the wall she was building and felt the matter under her palms, the specific texture of restructured debris, compressed and realigned at the molecular level into something that would hold, and she pressed into it. She pushed more matter into the wall, made it thicker, made it stronger than it needed to be for any practical purpose. Then she stepped back. She looked at the wall. She picked up the next piece of work and did it. Cecil Stedman had not slept in 51 hours. This was not unusual for him during a crisis, and he did not experience it as a hardship. Sleep deprivation past a certain threshold produced a specific narrowing of focus that he had learned, over decades, to use. Everything that wasn't the problem fell away. What remained was the problem, and the tools available to address it, and the gap between those two things. He sat at the head of the Gida Situation Room's central table with a coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago and a manila folder that he had read 11 times. The folder contained the combat data his analysts had assembled on Mark Grayson from every engagement on record, response times, force calibration patterns, tactical decision sequences, the specific ways that Mark's fighting style had evolved over 3 years of active deployment. He was looking for the gap. He had found 3. The first gap Mark optimized for minimum necessary force. He did not maximize. He calculated, and he applied what the calculation produced. This meant that if you could change what the calculation was operating on, you could alter his output. The second gap. Mark's response time was extraordinary but not omniscient. He reacted to what he could detect. He could not be everywhere simultaneously. Against a distributed threat operating across multiple locations, he would have to choose. The third gap, he was still operating with Dinosaurus as the planning function. Mark was the enforcement arm. David Hiles was the brain. Eliminating the pairings architecture, disrupting Hiles' operational capacity, degraded Mark's effectiveness in ways that engaging Mark directly could not. Cecil built his 3-phase response around these gaps, in sequence. He did not tell his team he expected any of the phases to win. He told them the goal was to make it expensive. Phase 1 activated at 0300 on the 4th day following the broadcast. Sinclair's reaniman deployed in 3 waves at 3 Dinosaurus-flagged secondary installations, a materials storage facility in rural Oregon, an engineering depot outside of Reykjavik, and a communication relay installation in northern Manitoba. The reanimen were not sent to fight Mark. They were sent to destroy the contents of the installations, equipment, data storage, engineering materials, the accumulated infrastructure of a 2-year planning operation. They reached the Oregon installation 4 minutes before Mark did. They reached Reykjavik before Mark arrived there. They did not reach Manitoba before Mark arrived there, because Mark arrived there 37 seconds after the Oregon engagement concluded and 44 seconds before the Manitoba wave had finished deploying. Cecil watched the feeds. His analyst said, quietly, what Cecil was already thinking: he's not going to both simultaneously. He's choosing sequence. Cecil, he could take all 3 at once. Yes, he's not. No. Cecil looked at the feeds. Mark was moving through the Manitoba installation, the reaniman engaging him in the confined space of the depot's main storage floor, moving in the waves Sinclair had designed. Each unit throwing itself into the path of the next engagement point to slow Mark's momentum. It was not effective. It was systematic in the way that meat processing was systematic, not intelligent resistance, but volume and persistence. Mark worked through them with the rhythmic efficiency of someone completing a task with a known endpoint. He struck with calibrated force, enough to disable each unit's structural integrity without destroying the facility around them. He was not angry. He was not in a hurry. He cleared the installation in 4 minutes and 19 seconds, including the time it took him to deposit the disabled units in a pile outside the eastern exit where Cecil's recovery teams could access them. Cecil's analyst, he managed his force output the entire time. He never exceeded what was necessary. Cecil, note the time. Note the movement pattern. He stood. Phase 2. The orbital strike authorization took 40 minutes to clear. The directed energy satellites, 3 of them, positioned in low Earth orbit across a triangle that covered the northern hemisphere's primary operational zones, were the Gida's highest-tier response asset. They had been designed for a threat level that nobody, until recently, had seriously expected to encounter on Earth's surface. They found Mark at altitude over the Pacific, moving between the Manitoba site and what his projected route suggested was a Dinosaurus secondary position in northern Canada. The first satellite fired. Mark took the hit. Cecil watched this and did not allow himself any reaction. The hit registered. The feed showed Mark's trajectory disrupted, a visible change in his flight path. He was not destroyed. He was displaced and damaged. and he righted himself, and his trajectory resumed. "He's hit," an analyst said. "I can see that." Cecil watched the feed. The second satellite fired. Mark had altered his altitude between the first and second shots, with the small, efficient adjustment of someone who had registered the attack vector and solved for the correction without breaking his forward movement. The second strike caught him at a different angle. He took it. He righted himself. He changed direction, toward the first satellite. Cecil watched him close the distance. The satellite fired twice more before Mark reached it. Both shots connected. Mark was absorbing hits that would have leveled a building, and his velocity was not decreasing. He reached the satellite. The feed terminated when his hands made contact with its primary structural housing. The feed from the second satellite showed the debris, falling in a specific distribution pattern, nothing entering a re-entry trajectory that would produce atmospheric burn over populated areas. Cecil's situation room was quiet. He thought about the re-entry, an analyst said. He planned the debris dispersal pattern while he was taking direct fire. Cecil did not respond. He was watching the third satellite's feed, watching Mark approach it with the same methodical velocity, watching the targeting system fire and register hits, and watch Mark continue anyway. The third satellite's feed terminated at 0611. Cecil sat back in his chair. He opened a drawer and removed a data drive. He had obtained it through channels he had never fully documented, a recording that had come to him through a deep space communication relay that the GATA monitored and that Mark did not know the GATA monitored. A private transmission from Mark Grayson to his son. Cecil had held it for 4 months, unsure of its utility. He was sure now. He authorized the broadcast to every frequency his intelligence files indicated Mark monitored. He did not listen to the recording as it transmitted. He had listened to it once, when it arrived, and that had been sufficient. He knew what was in it. A father's voice, speaking without performance, about what it was to carry a set of values that required terrible things, and to wonder, years later, whether the values had always been wrong or only the application. He called Donald into the room. "Get me Sinclair, all remaining reanimant units. And I want every intelligence brief on Dinosaurus's next projected operational target. Source quality is secondary. I want volume." Donald hesitated. "Director, if we can't, what is the goal?" "At this point, what are we—" "The goal," Cecil said, with the specific flatness of someone who had already resolved the question and found the answer insufficient and was committed to it anyway, "is to make it cost them something every day. Do you understand? Not to win. To cost them." "Go," Donald went. That night, in a secondary installation 300 miles from the nearest civilian population center, Mark told Dinosaurus about the recording. He sat at the planning table and recounted it the way he recounted operational data, sequentially, without editorial commentary. His father's voice. What Nolan had said about carrying values that required terrible things, the specific quality of doubt in the recording that Mark recognized as the thing Nolan had worked through and come out the other side of. Dinosaurus listened without interrupting. When Mark finished, Dinosaurus was quiet for a moment. Then, he found doubt eventually. "Are you finding doubt?" Mark considered this with the same care he gave any assessment. He looked at the projection running on the far wall, the same curves, the same numbers. "No," he said, "I'm finding grief. They're not the same." Dinosaurus looked at him. Something in his expression, not warmth, not quite, but the closest thing to recognition that David Hyles's face produced, settled and held. "No," he agreed. "They're not." He returned to his projections. Mark returned to his. Eve had been running on 4 hours of sleep a night for 6 weeks. She had stopped noticing it somewhere around week 3, the specific threshold where the body stopped protesting and started simply incorporating exhaustion as a baseline condition. She woke at 0500, worked until she could no longer maintain the concentration required for molecular-level restructuring, slept for 4 hours, and started again. The work, did not diminish. Every day that she cleared one section of one city, the scope of what remained recalibrated itself upward, because the scope was not a fixed quantity. It was a function of how many people needed shelter and food and clean water. She had built, in 6 weeks, functional temporary settlements housing 400,000 people across 6 coastal sites. She had created water purification infrastructure from raw atmospheric matter. She had grown food, restructuring organic matter from the flood debris into caloric nutrition that was not by any measure pleasant, but was edible and adequate, and kept people alive while the supply chains the Accord was restructuring began to reach the affected zones. She had also been running Dinosaurus's numbers in the background of her mind for 6 weeks. She had found things she disagreed with, the certainty of the projections, the inability of any model to adequately account for the speed of human adaptation under genuine existential pressure, the assumption that a controlled catastrophe remained controlled across its full implementation window. These were real methodological objections. She had written them down in the notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, and she had looked at them every few days, and they were still real, and they still did not, when she was honest with herself, make the core math wrong. This was the thing she had not told anyone. The math might be right. She did not know what to do with a world in which the math was right. She knew what she did with it practically. She kept building. She made the argument, in material form, that reconstruction was possible, that the world Mark and Dinosaurus had produced was not the only response to itself. This was not a counter-argument to the math. It was a different kind of statement, made with her hands, in concrete and water and the molecular rearrangement of whatever was available. She knew he would come eventually. She did not seek him out. She waited. He landed on a Tuesday morning. He came down 1/2 mile from the settlement's eastern boundary, at the edge of a ruined coastal district she had not yet touched, where the flood had deposited everything it carried, and then receded and left the deposit where it was. Broken furniture, building materials, the accumulated objects of interrupted lives. Her scouts reported his position within 10 minutes. She walked out alone. She found Mark standing in the debris field, not floating, standing, with his weight on the ground the way he stood when he was not thinking about standing. He looked up when she was 20 feet away. She stopped. She looked at him. She had not seen him since before the divergence. He looked the same physically, the black and white suit, the face she knew, the specific quality of his posture that had always communicated more than he intended it to. He also looked different in a way she was still cataloging. He looked like someone who had stopped carrying a particular weight and had not replaced it with anything. She said, "Tell me what you were thinking." Not a confrontation, a request. She actually wanted to know. He told her. He started at the beginning, the installation, the projection, the 3 scenarios. He walked her through the modeling the way Hiles had walked him through it. He did not editorialize. He did not soften the casualty figures, or qualify the counter-projection, or frame any of it in language designed to make it easier to hear. He told her what he had been shown, in the order it had been shown to him, and then he told her what he had concluded and why. Eve listened to all of it. She stood in the debris field and listened to him explain the math that had ended the lives of 39 million people, and she did not interrupt, and she did not look away. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know the math," she said. "I've been running it for 6 weeks. She stopped. Swallowed, "I've even found places where I can't argue with it. Mark, I know, but the people are real. I know that too. And you still, yes." The debris field was quiet around them. Somewhere in the middle distance, the settlement made its ambient sounds, voices, the movement of people engaged in the work of surviving. "How?" Eve said. Mark looked at her. "I think about who they were, all of them. I'm not telling you I don't. I think about them specifically, not as a number, as people with the specific weight of being real. He paused. And then I think about 4 billion people who will be real in 100 years because of this. And the math closes. Every time I run it. The math closes. The math doesn't close for me, Eve said. Her voice was level. I know. She looked at him. She was looking for something specific in his face. She did not know exactly what. But she was looking for it and not finding it. And the not finding it told her something she had suspected, but not confirmed. There's a flaw in the model, she said. Not in the math, in the premise. The model assumes that the people who survived will build something worth surviving into. It can't account for what kind of world you're creating with the enforcement mechanism. You can't math your way around the fact that a world held together by the threat of one person is not a stable system. Mark considered this with the genuine seriousness he gave any counter-argument. Dinosaurus's governance framework transitions authority to the planetary council within. The planetary council that Dinosaurus appoints, Eve said. With you enforcing compliance. Yes, and when you're gone, when something kills you or you make a mistake or the Empire comes back with something you can't handle alone, the framework persists. Frameworks don't persist without enforcement. You've built a world that needs you to hold it together. That's not a saved planet. That's a dependency. Mark was quiet. He was running the counter-argument against his models. She could see him doing it. It's a better dependency than the alternative, he said finally. Eve closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something had shifted in her expression. Not resignation, but the specific resolution of someone who has finished asking one kind of question and started asking another. I'm going to use everything I have to rebuild what you destroyed, she said. I'm going to make it as hard as possible for your governance to be the only thing keeping people alive. I'm going to show that there was another way. You'll make people's lives better, Mark said. That's the point. I know. He looked at her. I'm not going to stop you. You're not a threat to the outcome, you're a feature of it. People healing is part of what this was for. Eve stared at him. She knew, from the way he said it, without any awareness that it was the worst thing he had said in this conversation, that he was not being dismissive. He was being accurate. In his model, her grief work, her defiance, her 6 weeks of building shelter for 400,000 people had been classified and evaluated and filed under acceptable outcome variables. She felt it land somewhere beneath language. I'm going to find a way to stop you, she said. Not for the math. Because this was wrong. I hope you do, Mark said. She looked at him. I'm not being dismissive, he said. If you find an argument I haven't found, a real one with modeling, I want to hear it. I don't want to be doing this, Eve, he said it as a statement of fact. I just can't find a reason not to that outweighs the reason to. Eve looked at him for a long moment. She understood, in the way you understood things that you had been hoping were not true, that he was not going to change course. Not today. Not from this conversation. Possibly not ever, unless she found the argument he couldn't find, and she had been looking for 6 weeks and she had not found it yet. She turned. She walked back toward her settlement, back toward the 400,000 people who needed water and shelter and food, and the ongoing work of someone who had decided to build instead of argue. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard the displacement of air that meant he had gone up. She kept walking. She had work to do. Month 1. Global carbon output reduction, 23%. Primary driver, mandatory fossil fuel cessation compliance rate, 67%. The Southeast Asian Coalition had been falsifying environmental compliance data for 11 years. Not dramatically, not in ways that produced visible immediate harm, but in the specific, institutional way of organizations that had decided, incrementally and without any single decisive moment of corruption, that the gap between their reported metrics and their actual metrics was a problem they would address later. The deforestation numbers were half the actual rate. The carbon sequestration credits were calculated on models that had not been updated since 2019. Dinosaurus found the discrepancy in month 2 through a satellite imaging analysis that cross-referenced actual canopy density against reported land use data. Mark flew in on a Tuesday morning. He landed in the central courtyard of the regional administrative complex and walked through the main entrance and took the elevator to the 14th floor, where the relevant ministers had their offices. The security personnel in the lobby made the calculations available to them and did not impede his passage. He removed 4 ministers from their offices. Not violently, he picked each one up, walked back to the elevator, crossed the lobby, and placed them in the courtyard outside. The physical fact of being carried out of your office by a person who could have done significantly more and chose not to was sufficient communication. He told them, "The Planetary Council will appoint interim administration. Compliance reporting will be conducted by council-appointed auditors. If I come back, it will be because the numbers are wrong again." He flew away. Within the week, the deforestation had stopped. Within the month, the first replanting operations had begun. The forest did not know how it was saved. It continued growing. Month 2. Amazon deforestation rate, 0. Primary enforcement mechanism, aerial monitoring, Accord response protocol. The Mauler twins had been operating for 11 days in the chaos of the Accord's transition period before Dinosaurus identified their activity. Into the chaos of global economic restructuring and governmental transitions, the Maulers had inserted a project they had been planning for considerably longer, a large-scale cybernetic enhancement program using displaced populations in 3 flood-adjacent zones as test subjects. Not willing subjects. Dinosaurus flagged it to Mark at 0400 on a Thursday. Mark was operational by 0415. He found them in a converted industrial facility in the Hungarian flood border zone. The Maulers had security, not superhuman, but substantial, the kind of contracted private military that had proliferated in the governance gap following the broadcast. Mark moved through it without injuring anyone significantly. He found the Maulers in the facility's primary research floor. They attacked immediately. This was correct behavior. They had fought Mark before, and they knew that time favored him. They came at him from 2 directions simultaneously, using the lab equipment as both cover and improvised weapons, consoles, structural supports, a centrifuge that one of them threw with the specific kinetic creativity of someone who had been fighting with whatever was available for decades. Mark took the centrifuge in the chest. He absorbed the impact and redirected his momentum into the wall behind him, used the wall as a push-off point, and closed the distance to the Mauler on his left faster than the throw's follow-through could be corrected for. He put that Mauler down with a strike to the collarbone, enough force to fracture it, not enough to produce structural damage that would require anything beyond 6 weeks of healing. He was calibrating while he moved, which was the thing about Mark's fighting that had gotten consistently harder to counter. The calibration never stopped, even in the middle of an exchange. The second Mauler hit him from behind with both fists locked together, a combined mass strike that genuinely moved him. Mark caught himself. He turned. They fought for 4 minutes. The Maulers were good, genuinely, technically good, coordinating with the fluency of identical men who had trained to fight as a pair since they first existed, who had built a combat language from shared reflexes and decades of identical conditioning. They connected repeatedly. They produced real impact. They found angles that forced Mark to react rather than initiate, and they used those angles intelligently. Mark was still faster, still more durable, and still calibrating the entire time. He put the second Mauler down with a strike to the knee that buckled the joint, not broken, but non-functional for the next several weeks, and then stood in the center of the floor with both of them on the ground and the facility's secondary alarm cycling uselessly overhead. One of them, face against the floor, said, "You're the villain now, Grayson. Can't you see it?" Mark looked at him. He was already walking away. He did not respond. The question had been asked with the expectation that it would produce something: guilt, anger, doubt. He had run that question against his models many times. The question did not change the models. He secured both Maulers in Accord custody before 0600 and was back at the planning installation by 0630. Month 2. Ocean temperature stabilization trend confirmed. Coral reef bleaching events declined 41%. In a rebuilt coastal city in what had been the Gulf Coast of the United States, a man stole food from a market stall. He took 2 protein blocks. The market was open air, staffed by volunteers from Eve's network. He took them quickly, reflexively, with the specific body language of someone who had been hungry long enough that the calculation had simplified. The vendor saw him. He knew she saw him. He looked at her. She looked at him. Above them, visible at altitude, far up, moving slowly along the horizon line in the specific steady arc of something following a monitoring route, a black and white figure crossed the sky. It was there for perhaps 4 seconds. Then it was gone. The man put the food back. He straightened. He walked away without running. The vendor watched him go. She did not call after him. She stood behind her stall and looked at the empty sky where the figure had been, and stood very still for a moment. Then a customer arrived, and she served them, and the market continued its ordinary noise, and the morning proceeded. Month 3. Accord compliance rate 89%. Projected timeline to target stabilization threshold revised to within 43 years of original projection. Late in Month 3, Dinosaurus and Mark reviewed the projection updates together. The models were showing better outcomes than Dinosaurus's most optimistic pre-implementation scenarios. The carbon reduction curve was steeper than projected. The rewilding corridors were establishing faster than the 3-year estimates. Dinosaurus read the numbers in the flat, careful voice he used for everything. The margin is improving. At current compliance rates, we may reach the target stabilization threshold a decade ahead of projection. Mark nodded. He was looking at the ocean temperature curves. Dinosaurus set down his report. Then, with the specific care of someone selecting words for a purpose, "Are you all right?" Mark looked up. "Define the metric." Dinosaurus paused. "I suppose I mean, are you finding the work sustainable?" Mark looked at the projection. "The work is effective. That's the metric." Dinosaurus looked at him for a moment longer. He did not push further. He returned to his projections. Mark returned to the ocean temperature curves. The installation hummed. They came down over the Pacific at 0340 local time. 3 figures, descending from high orbit at a velocity that produced heat signatures visible on every remaining G-Day tracking system simultaneously. Bright transient streaks that the monitoring software flagged as meteor activity before the mass-to-velocity ratio resolved into something that meteors did not produce. The tracking systems recalculated. The alerts changed category. Cecil was awake when the alerts arrived. He looked at the data on his monitor, and he picked up his phone, and then he set it back down, because there was no call to make that would change the shape of what the data was showing him. He opened a new file and began documenting. The 3 figures landed in a field in the Kazakh steppe, open grassland, flat in every direction for 50 kilometers. The kind of terrain that communicated choice rather than accident. They landed without slowing gradually, without any concession to the drama of arrival. They simply decelerated from orbital velocity to ground level in the last 300 meters and stood in the grass as if they had been standing there all along. Conquest stood at the center. He was old in the way that things built for violence got old, not fragile, but marked, the accumulated record of centuries of combat written in the specific architecture of his scarring and the massive, worn quality of his frame. He stood with the weight distribution of someone who had been standing in fields waiting for fights for longer than most civilizations had existed. He was not impatient. He was not performing confidence. He simply was what he was, without any gap between the surface and the substance. The two figures flanking him were younger, not young by human measure, but young by Viltrumite standard, which meant they carried their capability without the sediment of centuries of tactical experience. They waited. Mark dropped out of the sky 40 minutes later. He came straight down, not at combat velocity, not with any approach that implied he was assessing the tactical situation from altitude. He came down the way you came down when you had already made your assessment and the assessment had resolved. He landed 20 feet from Conquest and stood. The grass between them moved in the wind. Nothing else did. Conquest looked him over with the specific professional attention of someone who had been evaluating threats for 4 centuries. He took in the suit, the posture, the absence of anything in Mark's body language that read as performance. "Grayson," Conquest said, "the Empire has been watching your work here. I know. A half-blood, governing a pre-Viltrumite world. It's either impressive or pathetic. The Empire hasn't decided which. The Empire doesn't have to decide anything about Earth," Mark said. "Earth is governed, by you, by the planetary accord. I enforce it." Conquest looked at the field around them, the flat grassland, the instrumented ground that he could not see and had not yet identified. His eyes moved across the terrain with the attention of someone who had walked into enough traps to have developed a sense for when the ground was not simply ground. And if the Empire decides the Accord is not compatible with our expansion plans, then the Empire loses the scouts it sent to make that assessment. Conquest was still. "You've gotten more direct since we last met. I remember a boy who talked a lot. I had more things to say then." The two younger Viltrumites exchanged a look. Conquest kept his attention on Mark with the focus of someone who understood that looking away was information he was giving rather than taking. He made the offer, as a professional courtesy, an acknowledgement that the outcome of a negotiated arrangement might be more efficient than the alternative. Join the Empire formally. Bring Earth into the fold. The planet would be productive, well-managed, an asset rather than an acquisition problem. Mark said no. The Empire will take it regardless. You should go back and tell them what you found here. Give them time to adjust their assessment. You're telling me to retreat. I'm telling you to go home. There's a difference. Conquest looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass. In the mobile unit 3 kilometers back along the field's northern boundary, Dinosaurus was watching the tactical feed and running timing calculations on a secondary terminal. Conquest attacked. He moved without announcement, no shift in posture, no preparatory motion, simply an instantaneous transition from standing to combat velocity that Mark had been anticipating and was still, given Conquest's experience, slightly behind on. The speed was not the thing that marked 4 centuries of combat. Plenty of Viltrumites were fast. What marked 4 centuries was the absence of any wasted motion in the transition, no wind-up, no tell, just the sudden fact of a strike arriving at the precise angle and force that would produce the most information about the target's current capability. The first strike caught him in the upper chest, a measuring one, the kind that a 4-century veteran used to establish force baselines before committing to a sequence. It moved Mark. Not far, 3 feet, his boots leaving shallow furrows in the soil, but it moved him. And the fact that it moved him told Conquest what he needed to know about the current force differential. The 2 younger Viltrumites committed simultaneously in the classic 3-point engagement geometry, forcing the single target to manage 3 attack vectors, while each vector fed information to the others. Mark took the first young Viltrumite's strike on his forearm, a deflection, redirecting the force, and used the rotation it produced to generate a counterstrike to the side of the Viltrumite's head. He hit precisely, enough force to fracture the orbital bone, producing the specific disorientation that accompanied structural damage to the skull in that location. The young Viltrumite dropped lateral velocity and grabbed for the ground instinctively. Mark was already moving to the second. He stepped inside the incoming strike, taking the grazing contact on his shoulder to get the position, and drove a knee into the second Viltrumite's solar plexus at the upward angle that maximized force transfer. The Viltrumite folded. 7 seconds. Both scouts were on the ground, functional but not immediately combat effective. Conquest had used those 7 seconds well. He was already in a ground-level grapple position when Mark turned back, a controlled engagement range that eliminated Mark's ability to use velocity as a force multiplier. Close range was the environment where his superior experience became the dominant variable. He hit Mark 3 times in the next 4 seconds. Each one landed, and each one cost Mark something, accumulating in the way that Conquest's fighting always accumulated, each strike placing the next one, each exchange building toward a position Conquest had been engineering since before first contact. Mark was fighting defensively. He was buying time, and they both knew it. Dinosaurus activated the emitters. The field's instrumented ground had been 7 months in preparation, 32 sonic pulse emitters buried at specific intervals across the landing zone's most likely engagement geometry, each one calibrated to a frequency range that Dinosaurus had engineered from 2 sources. Mark's own first-hand account of Viltrumite inner ear physiology. The specific biological architecture Mark understood through his own body and had described in precise detail over months of planning sessions, and the Coalition of Planets acoustic weapon research, which Mark had brought back from his dealings with the Coalition and shared with Hiles during the Accord's preparatory phase. The frequency was not audible. It was designed to do one specific thing to one specific biological structure. Conquest's head moved, not from impact, from the inside. His vestibular system, which had been managing his spatial orientation at combat-level precision for 4 centuries, registered something it could not process as normal input, and sent signals to his motor system that did not correspond to the actual geometry of the situation. His grip on Mark's arm loosened, not because he chose to, but because his body responded before his mind could override. He dropped 6 inches. He caught himself. The flight mechanism in his inner ear stuttered and re-engaged and stuttered again. Mark broke the grip. He put distance between them, 15 feet, enough to re-establish the velocity differential, and turned to assess. The 2 younger Viltrumites had simply lost their flight mechanism entirely. Grounded by disorientation, they did not have 4 centuries of vestibular training to partially manage. Without flight, the tactical geometry of the engagement had changed entirely. Conquest was managing, still standing, still dangerous, still tracking Mark, but his movements were compensated, adjusted for a disruption he was fighting through rather than operating past. In his forward stance, the very slight tremor was the only concession he made to a vestibular system working harder than it usually needed to. He looked at the ground. Then the perimeter. He was finding the emitter architecture by inference, not seeing it, but understanding it from the pattern of what his body was telling him. "You planned this," Conquest said. "The landing site." "Dinosaurus planned it," Mark said. Conquest scanned the field's perimeter slowly. "Where is it?" "Close enough," Mark said. The younger Viltrumites were attempting to stand. The wind moved through the field. Conquest had not stopped being dangerous. He had been made, for the first time in this engagement, into a problem that required solving rather than a condition that simply existed. He recalibrated. He attacked again. Conquest adapted. This was the specific horror of fighting someone 4 centuries old, not the raw capability, which Mark had already mapped, but the adaptation. Conquest had been in situations where the ground betrayed him, where the environment was instrumented against him. He had developed, across 4 centuries, a response to unexpected conditions that was not a specific tactic but a quality of attention, a willingness to abandon the current model entirely and build a new one from what the present moment was actually offering. What the present moment offered. A field where his flight mechanism was unreliable, 2 younger Viltrumites who were grounded and recovering. and a half-blood opponent using range and velocity as his primary force multipliers. Conquest's solution: eliminate the range. He moved to ground-level engagement, the close-range striking distance where velocity advantage required space to build that he was actively denying. He moved low, below the emitter field's peak disruption band, where the frequency concentration was strongest at chest height and weaker near the ground. He had located the band by the pattern of his own disruption. He was using his own disorientation as a mapping tool. Mark matched the range. He had to. Letting Conquest establish close-quarters dominance on his own terms was worse than engaging on Conquest's preferred ground. They traded in the compressed space where velocity counted for less and experience counted for more, and Mark felt the difference in every exchange. Conquest hit with the specificity of someone who had spent centuries learning exactly where to place force to produce the maximum subsequent disadvantage. Each strike was positioned for the next one. Each exchange was a sentence in a language Mark was still learning, and Conquest was fluent in it in a way that could not be replicated by raw capability alone, because the fluency was not a property of his body. It was a property of time. Of having made every available mistake so many decades ago that the mistakes had been replaced by their corrections, and those corrections had become automatic. And the automaticity had been tested until it was something closer to instinct than technique. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye. He had 2 ribs protesting in the way that meant stress fracture rather than clean break. His left forearm had absorbed 3 impacts in the same location, and the cumulative effect was registering as meaningful degradation in his blocking response time. He was buying time, and the time was costing him, and the equation was running toward a terminal point. The 2 younger Viltrumites were recovering. Dinosaurus ran the numbers in the mobile unit. He had been running them continuously since the engagement began, updating his probability assessment every 30 seconds. The emitter field had performed within projected parameters. Conquest's adaptation had been faster than the median estimate, but within the outer boundary of the model's variance. He ran the 3-on-1 probability assessment for Mark, against 2 recovered scouts, plus a partially adapted Conquest at close range. He ran it again. He ran it a 3rd time using the most optimistic input parameters. The output did not change in any version that the model could produce. He had been building the secondary device for 6 months, in preparation for the specific scenario that his models had always identified as the most likely critical failure point. A Viltrumite response was not a possibility he had modeled as unlikely. He had modeled it as probable and had engineered accordingly. The device was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It was a chemical reaction that his beast-form body chemistry could trigger, a specific enzymatic cascade that his transformed state produced at sufficient concentration to initiate a yield he had calculated over 47 iterations. The calculation was exact. He put the mobile unit in gear. Mark saw the unit moving across the field from his peripheral awareness, registering its approach the way you registered things in your periphery during a fight that might be relevant. He was in the middle of an exchange with Conquest. The unit was moving at vehicle speed. It was not an immediate variable. Then he tracked its trajectory. He understood what Dinosaurus was doing, not the mechanism. He did not know the specific mechanism. He understood the conclusion. He had worked alongside David Hiles for months. He knew how David Hiles solved problems. He knew what David Hiles did when the calculation produced a specific answer and the answer required something that could not be asked of anyone else. He broke from Conquest. He moved toward the unit. Conquest caught him, not a clean grab, but enough contact to redirect his momentum for 2 seconds while the grip established. Mark broke it faster than Conquest expected. The break cost him the skin on his forearm, and he did not stop moving. The loudspeaker on the mobile unit crackled. Dinosaurus's voice: "The numbers hold. Mark, remember that. The numbers hold. Mark, David, the numbers hold." Mark was at maximum velocity when the detonation occurred. The blast was not what the word implied. It was a concussive event, a chemical yield release of sufficient magnitude that the pressure wave moved outward from the mobile unit's position at a speed, and force that the surrounding air did not have the structural integrity to resist. The grass in a 400-meter radius went flat in the same instant. The soil in a 60-meter radius was displaced downward. The two younger Viltrumites were at the center of the effect radius. They had been recovering, standing, not airborne. The concussive force produced the specific kind of catastrophic structural damage that even Viltrumite durability could not entirely absorb at that proximity and yield. Conquest was moving when the detonation registered. His motion provided partial mitigation, and 4 centuries of structural density absorbed what the younger Viltrumites could not. He took the wave and it drove him across the field at a velocity that was not flight and not controlled, and he came down 200 meters from the detonation point and did not immediately get back up. Mark was at the edge of the blast radius. His velocity had carried him far enough that the wave hit at significantly attenuated force. He came down in the field and got to his feet. The crater where the mobile unit had been was 30 feet across and still producing the specific chemical smell of a reaction that had fully exhausted itself. There was no fire. Dinosaurus had calculated the yield with the same precision he applied to everything. The crater was exactly as large as the calculation required, and no larger. Mark stood at the edge of it. He was aware of his breathing. He was aware of the cut above his eye and the ribs and the forearm. He was aware of all of these things as data, as inputs to the assessment he was continuously running. He did not let himself be aware of the other thing yet. There was still work. He looked at the crater for a long time. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides, and they were not entirely still, and he made them still by deciding they would be still. He said, very quietly, to the crater in the empty field and no one, "The numbers hold." His voice was level. It had cost him something to make it level. He made it level anyway, because the alternative was not available to him right now. He turned. Conquest was 200 meters away, on the ground, breathing. His healing was already working. Viltrumite biology did not wait for instruction, but the damage was structural in ways that healing did not close quickly. He was alive. He was injured in ways that would take hours to meaningfully address. Mark walked toward him. The field was quiet. The grass had begun to right itself where the pressure wave had flattened it. Behind him, the crater did not change. Conquest was on his back in the grass when Mark reached him. He was not unconscious. His eyes were open and tracking, the specific, focused tracking of a being whose body was doing the most urgent work of keeping itself functional, and whose mind was running a parallel assessment of the tactical situation regardless. He was breathing in the careful, deliberate way of someone whose rib cage was damaged, and who had learned, over centuries. That controlled breathing was the difference between functional and non-functional. His left arm was gone at the shoulder. The detonation had removed it, cleanly, in the way that sufficient force applied at a structural weak point produced a clean outcome rather than a complicated one. His right arm was present, but was not moving in the way that an arm moved when the surrounding musculature was intact. He was, for the first time in any engagement Mark had experienced with him, genuinely unable to initiate combat. He looked up at Mark standing over him. He did not say anything. He was past the part of the fight where saying things was productive. Mark crouched down. He looked at him directly, the way you looked at something you were assessing rather than something you were angry at. "You're going to survive this," Mark said. "Your biology will close most of it. The arm will take longer." Conquest looked at him. His expression was not pain. It was the expression of a 4-century-old warrior computing the current situation with the resources available to him, and finding that the resources available to him did not include any option that changed the present outcome. "The scouts," Conquest said. His voice was damaged in the way voices were damaged when the structures that produced them had been through something significant. "Dead," Mark said. Conquest absorbed this without visible reaction. He had known it before asking. He was confirming data. The device was Hiles, Conquest said. Yes, he's dead. Yes, Conquest was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the sky above Mark, not at Mark, at the sky, with the attention of someone who needed a surface to put their thinking against while they did it. You came alone, Conquest said. No other assets, no backup. There isn't any. Conquest looked back at Mark. Something moved in his expression, the specific acknowledgement of a professional encountering a situation that resolves cleanly against his prior assessment. What do you do with me? Leave you here. You'll be mobile in a few hours. Your biology will give you back enough function to fly. And then? Then, you go back. You tell the Empire what you found. You tell them about the field. You tell them about Hiles. You tell them everything accurate about the engagement. Mark stood. Give them the real numbers. Let them make their assessment. Conquest looked at him. You want them to know what it cost. I want them to know the accurate version of what happened here. What they do with it is their decision. Mark looked at the field, at the flat grass, the crater, the empty sky. I'm not going to pretend it was easy. That doesn't serve either of us. He flew up. He went to orbital altitude before he composed the message. He needed the distance, not emotionally, but practically. The message required a specific quality of clarity that was easier to produce in the clean physics of orbital space than in the field with Conquest's damaged breathing and the smell of the crater. Up here there was no ambient context competing for his attention. No grass, no wind, no the slowly riding stalks at the edge of where the pressure wave had run out. Just the planet below him and the dark above him and the specific silence of a space that had no opinion about what he had just done and no interest in whether he had done it correctly. He had made this orbit his thinking place over the months. He did not call it that. He did not acknowledge it as a practice. But when he needed to compose something that the day's work did not allow him to reach, he came up here, and the distance produced the clarity. And he worked with what the clarity gave him. He broadcast on every frequency Dinosaurus's intelligence files had identified as monitored by Viltrumite Imperial Communications, a list built from 7 years of signal analysis, cross-referenced against coalition intelligence that Mark had obtained through channels that no longer officially existed, but had left their data behind. Earth is governed, he said. The planetary accord is in effect. 3 Empire scouts came to this planet. They are dead. If the Empire sends a fleet, I will do what I do here every day, work the problem until the problem is solved. I am not asking for acknowledgement. I am providing information. What you do with it is your decision. He paused. My name is Mark Grayson. I was born on this planet. I have decided it will survive. Factor that into your calculations. He closed the broadcast. He stayed at orbital altitude for a while, not thinking about anything specific. Looking at the planet below, the blue and the white and the green that was already in visible increments, more green than it had been a year ago. The rewilding corridors were visible from orbit now in the most advanced implementation zones. Not dramatically visible, you had to know where to look. But they were there. He went down. Deep in Imperial space, the transmission reached a Viltrumite command vessel 11 days later. A commander received it in the vessel's communications center, played it twice, and sent it to the fleet's Strategic Analysis Division, with a priority flag the Analysis Division had not received in several years. The report that came back was not long. It contained verified tactical data on the engagement, the sonic field, the chemical detonation, the loss of 2 scouts and Conquest, and a single assessment paragraph the commander read 3 times. The paragraph noted, the planetary administrator was a Viltrumite-born individual with demonstrated capability at or above the assessed level of the lost scouting party, including Senior General Conquest. The planetary defense architecture included non-Viltrumite design elements specifically engineered against Viltrumite biology. The cost-benefit assessment of forced acquisition versus waiting for a more favorable engagement window was outside the analysis division's operational authority to resolve, but the data supported either a significant escalation in resource commitment or a strategic delay pending further intelligence. The commander forwarded the report to High Command. He received a response 7 days later: pull back. Send the data to High Command. Let them compute the value ratio. The fleet maintained its position outside the system's outer boundary and did not advance. Mark returned to the primary governance installation at 1800. He walked through it from the entrance, past the planning terminals still running their projection updates, past the communications infrastructure Dinosaurus had built over 2 years into something more capable than most national intelligence agencies, past the storage systems with their climate modeling libraries and their Accord implementation databases. He walked through all of it to the main planning room. The room was the same as it always was. The projection was running, the curves he knew, the numbers, the shapes that the data made when you plotted it honestly across time. The 2 chairs at the main table were in the positions they were always in. He sat down at his side. He looked at Dinosaurus's chair. He looked at it for a while, not with any expression that produced itself on his face. He looked at it the way you looked at something you were incorporating into your operational picture. He pulled up the day's environmental metrics. Month 8. Global carbon output reduction, 41%. Compliance rate, 92%. Rewilding corridor establishment, tracking 14% ahead of schedule. Ocean temperature, declining toward baseline, 3 years ahead of projection. He read all of it in the flat, careful way he read everything now. He made notes. He assigned 4 tasks to Planetary Council administrators. He looked at the projection on the wall, the curves running out 3 centuries, the shape of a species that was going to survive, not cleanly, not without cost, not in any way that could be called triumph, but survive. Dinosaurus's chair was empty. The projection did not acknowledge this. The curves continued their work regardless. Mark opened the next report and began reading it aloud, in the specific flat voice he used for data that required accurate retention, to the room and the empty chair, and the projection, and no one. Day 241 of the Planetary Accord. Atmospheric carbon, 312 parts per million, declining. Biodiversity index, 0.64, trending upward. Accord compliance rate, 92%. Viltrumite contact, fleet presence confirmed at outer system boundary, holding position, not advancing. He paused. Projected survival probability for Homo sapiens, next 3 centuries, 78% and improving. He closed the report. He sat in the room with the hum of the equipment and the running projection and the empty chair and the numbers that were getting better every week. He opened the next report. He kept working. A neutral voice. Documentary and register. Delivering information the way information was meant to be delivered, without inflection, without the editorial pressure of someone who wanted you to feel a particular way about what you were hearing. Year 16 of the Planetary Accord. Global population, 7.1 billion, down from peak, stabilizing within projected parameters. Global carbon output, 6% of pre-accord levels. Ocean temperature, trending toward baseline recovery, 11 years ahead of original projection. Biodiversity index, 0.89, improving. Species extinction events in the current year, 0. Wars, international conflicts, organized armed resistance, 0. Accord-authorized enforcement actions, current year, 41, down from 96 in year 12. A pause. The planet is healing. The rewilding corridors were visible from commercial flight altitude now. Not dramatically, you had to know where to look, and you had to know what you were looking at, but across the Central European corridor, across the North American interior, across the vast recovered grasslands of Central Asia, where a field in Kazakhstan had been instrumented with sonic emitters 16 years ago and had since been returned to native steppe ecology, the green was measurably different. It was deeper. It was more varied. The satellite imaging showed canopy density indices that the pre-Accord projections had not expected to see for another 30 years. The rivers ran at chemical compositions that water quality researchers described in their reports with language that occasionally broke out of scientific register into something that read almost like surprise. The North Atlantic fishery had returned to biomass levels not recorded since the 1970s. The coral systems in the Coral Sea were showing active growth. The sky above the rebuilt coastal cities was clear in the specific way of skies that had not been processing industrial output for 16 years. People who had been children at the time of the Accord and were now in their mid-20s had grown up breathing air that their parents described, in conversations those parents kept mostly private, as different. Better, the children did not have a comparison point. They simply breathed it. They also did not speak against the Accord, not publicly, not in any forum that produced a record. This was not a law, exactly. The Accord's text did not contain a provision prohibiting speech. What it contained was a classification system for planetary threat activity that was broad enough, and the enforcement response certain enough that the practical distinction between what you could say and what you did not say had collapsed into a single category. People were not unhappy. Precisely, they were compliant, which was different, and they had learned not to examine the difference in any venue that mattered. In what had been southern France, in a rebuilt coastal town that sat above the former floodline, at an elevation that Dinosaurus's rebuilding mandates had specified before the concrete was poured, a woman named Adel filed her weekly compliance report at 0800 on a Thursday morning. She was 34. She was the regional Accord administrator for a district of 60,000 people, and she was good at her job in the specific way of someone who had made peace with what her job required, and had stopped keeping an account of the peace. She filed accurate numbers. The resource usage, the population metrics, the energy consumption, the compliance flags. She noted 2 individuals under Accord non-compliance protocol review. One had been storing water reserves beyond the permitted personal allocation. One had been convening unregistered assemblies, meetings of 7 to 12 people, rotating locations, content unknown. She filed the report, received an automated acknowledgement and case numbers, and went home. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table and looked at the window for a while. She was not conflicted. She had resolved the conflict a long time ago, around year 4, when she understood that the resolution was a permanent condition of the world she lived in and that carrying the conflict as an open account was a cost that produced nothing. She had filed it closed and had not reopened it. She drank her coffee. Outside, the air was clean and the town was quiet, and the morning was the specific ordinary morning of a world that had been saved. Cecil Stedman was 81 years old. He moved more slowly than he had. His left knee had been replaced twice. The second replacement was holding. But the holding required acknowledgement. He sat at a desk in a basement, in a city he had not disclosed to anyone outside his network, and he wrote by hand in a notebook with a pen he bought in bulk because the supplier was reliable. His network was 293 people. He knew every one of them by name. Most were former GIDA operatives, people who had been doing this work before the Accord and had continued doing it after, because they did not know how to stop, and because stopping had always meant the work was finished, and the work was not finished. They did not fight Mark. Cecil had stopped believing that was possible around year 4. He had run the numbers himself, the same kind of numbers Cecil had always run, the kind that stripped the problem of sentiment and left only the architecture of what was possible and what was not. The architecture had been unambiguous. What he did instead was what he had always done when the direct option was closed. he found the adjacent option that remained. And he worked it with everything he had. What they did, they documented. Every enforcement action, every name, every detail of the 41 cases the year's compliance report would list under authorized enforcement actions. Cases that the report would record as numbers and that Cecil's network recorded as people. Names, ages, the specific circumstances of each case, the outcome. Cecil wrote it all down, by hand. In notebooks stored in 7 distributed locations that his system rotated on a schedule only he and 2 deputies held in full. He did not believe the notebooks would matter in any timeline he would live to see. He was 81 and the math on his remaining operational years was not generous. He believed the notebooks would matter eventually. He could not prove this. It was the one thing he held that was not a calculation. He kept writing. Eve's daughter was 9 years old. Her name was Kara, and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's specific quality of attention. The way she looked at things as if she was deciding what they were made of, as if the surface was always a question about the inside. She had grown up in the Humanitarian Network's central facility in what had been rebuilt as a community hub on the Gulf Coast. Surrounded by volunteers, by the ongoing work of her mother's organization, by the specific texture of a life lived in service of a project that never ended. On a Thursday afternoon, the same Thursday that Adele filed her report, the same Thursday that Cecil wrote in his notebook, Kara sat on the exterior steps of the facility and watched the sky. There was a streak in it, far up, moving slowly along the horizon in the steady arc of something following a route, a black and white figure, barely visible at this altitude, tracking a monitoring path that it had been tracking for 16 years. She watched it until it was gone. Eve came out and sat beside her on the steps. She had been inside reviewing supply allocation for the network's Eastern District, and she had the specific look of someone who had been working and had noticed through a window that her daughter was sitting outside watching the sky. Kara said, "Who is that?" Eve looked at the place in the sky where the streak had been. She was quiet for a moment. "That's the man who saved the planet." Kara looked at her. "Is he a hero?" Eve looked at the empty sky. She looked at it for long enough that Kara understood she was not being ignored, but was being given the honest version of the answer, which was taking longer to construct than the simple version would have. "He saved the planet," Eve said. Kara was 9, and she understood in the way that children understood things by watching the space around answers rather than the answers themselves, that her mother had said the same words twice and meant them differently each time. She did not push. She had learned, by watching her mother work, that some things were too large to hold all at once and had to be approached in pieces. She looked back at the sky. Eve put her arm around her daughter. They sat on the steps together while the sky held its ordinary afternoon light and the network's facility made its ordinary sounds behind them, and the world continued its ordinary healing in every direction. Mark's station had been in orbit for 13 years. It was not grand. It was not designed to be. He had designed it himself, in year 3, with the same functional minimalism that had governed every other decision in the Accord's implementation. A monitoring hub, a communications center, a small living space that contained what was operationally necessary. It looked like what it was, a workplace built by someone who had no further interest in the distinction between working and living. He was at the primary console when the day's reports arrived. He read them in order. The carbon data first, the most structurally significant metric from which everything else derived. Then the ocean temperatures. Then the biodiversity indices. Then the compliance reports, which he read with the same flat attention he gave everything, noting the aggregate numbers, flagging 2 cases that required council review, routing 3 others to regional administrators. He pulled up the long-range projection, the model that ran out 3 centuries, the same model that Dinosaurus had built in the Arctic installation 16 years ago. updated continuously since, refined by every year of actual implementation data into something considerably more precise than its original version. The projected survival probability for the human species over the next millennium, 94.7%. He had looked at this number every day for 3 years. It had improved by 2.3% in that time. The improvement was not dramatic on any individual day. Over 3 years, 2.3% was the difference between a model that was working and a model that was working well. He thought about Dinosaurus. Not with any particular quality of feeling, the feeling had been processed, over years, into a kind of permanent notation. David Hiles had been right. The numbers held. The fact of his being right was documented in the projection updating itself every day with better data. That was the memorial. It was the only kind that Hiles would have chosen. He thought about Eve. He knew about her organization. It appeared in the compliance feeds, its metrics perfectly maintained, its work extending into domains that the Accord's infrastructure had not fully addressed. He had not interfered with it. He would not. She had built the thing she said she would build. In the 16 years since their conversation in the debris field, she had built it into something that served millions of people and that operated with a quality of genuine human investment that the Accord's systems could not replicate. He had classified it, in his models, as an essential feature of the system. He understood that she would find this intolerable. He had not told her. He thought about Nolan. His father had come back in year 5, arriving at the station without announcement, standing in the docking bay with the specific expression of a man who recognized something in his son's face that he had hoped not to recognize. They had spoken for 40 minutes. Nolan had said, "It gets very quiet." He had left. He had not returned. Mark had noted the accuracy of the observation and had incorporated it into his operational picture and had continued working. He thought about Cecil. He knew about the network. He knew about the notebooks. He could have ended it at any time. The network was not a planetary threat. It was 293 old people and former operatives documenting things that were already documented in the Accord's official records. He had not ended it. He would not. Someone should record it. The fact that Cecil had determined the same thing independently was not surprising. Cecil had always understood, underneath the institutional apparatus, what actually mattered. He opened the final report of the day. He read it aloud. To the room, to the equipment, to the viewport and the planet below it, to no one. Day 5,843. Atmospheric carbon, 280 parts per million, declining. Biodiversity index, 0.89. Trending upward. Projected agricultural yield surplus, 14%. Species extinction events, year-to-date, 0. Viltrumite contact, none in 9 months. Accord compliance rate, 99.1%. Projected survival probability for Homo sapiens, next millennium, 94.7%. He closed the report. The station hummed. The equipment ran its continuous cycles. The viewport showed the planet below, blue and green, the specific blue and green of a world that was healing in every measurable dimension, that was producing the outcomes the math had required, that would survive in the ways the projection showed it surviving. It looked, from this distance, like something worth saving. Mark looked at it for a while. He did not feel what looking at it was supposed to produce. He felt the weight of it, the ongoing, permanent weight of a thing that did not end, that would not end, that required someone to be here every day reading the reports and routing the cases and watching the numbers improve by fractions that accumulated into survival. He was here. He would be here tomorrow. He opened the next report. He kept working. Below him, the planet turned. The sky above it was the cleanest it had been in 200 years. No one looked up. Let us know what you'd like to see. The end.